Morning, everyone. Happy Friday. I'm glad to have you join us with our colleagues from Homes RI for a quick overview of zoning and land use challenges as it relates to affordable housing throughout our state. Today, we're particularly focusing on communities in Cranston and Warwick, and are providing this information to local, state, and local officials to help inform your thinking around planning and growth in your communities, and encouraging the growth and development of more affordable housing. So thank you very much to our colleagues at Housing Network and Homes RI for organizing these meetings for us today. We look forward to further conversations throughout the state. I'm Brenda Clement, and I'm Director of HousingWorks Rhode Island, and I'm joined today by my colleagues from HousingWorks to talk a little bit about our fact book and some data and information about housing, and then to take a little bit of a deeper dive into zoning. So I think we'll get started, and I'll turn it over first to our Research and Policy Director. First of all, I didn't mention Katie West and Harrison from Homes RI and Housing Network are here with us today too, and are great advocates and supporters of work around housing and great resources. And now I'm going to turn it over to HousingWorks Research and Policy Director Annette Bourne to walk us through a few of the first slides around the fact book. And all of this information will be available on, here's the team, thank you. All of these, this data and this PowerPoint and other information will be available after this presentation as well. So take it away, Annette.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for watching us. As Brenda just mentioned, we are combined today with our colleagues at Housing Network and Homes RI. We will do a very brief overview of some affordability issues from the 2023 Housing Fact Book, and talk a little bit about, zoning in the news, really, which is kind of everywhere. If you haven't noticed it, it's been in the Rhode Island legislature for the last couple of years, but we are not alone. And then I will be handing things off to Bryce Kelly, our senior research analyst, to really talk about, a very big lift that HousingWorks has undertaken by creating the Rhode Island Zoning Atlas. So please advance the slide. These are clips from the 2023 Housing Fact Book. Most people are very familiar with these pages. They are the pages that most everyone turns to when they get the fact book. Not big surprises here. Housing is becoming increasingly unaffordable to those median households in our state, particularly in our largest cities. Providence, outside of Providence, Cranston and Warwick really hold up the bulk of the state. Cranston and Warwick consistently battling it out as to largest population and households. And what you will see on this slide is not only is it really unaffordable to buy in each of these cities for a median household, but it is also unaffordable to rent. I will remind everyone, rental numbers are difficult to come by given the kind of housing stock we have. And these are all 2022 numbers because it is the 2023 Housing Fact Book. But I can tell you now, as we are working on the 2024 Housing Fact Book, the numbers are not going to be getting any better soon. Next slide, please. So when you do get this recording, I want you to understand that when you get the PDF for these slides, all of these headlines are linked. Click on a link and you will be able to read the actual article. The point of this slide here is to just show you that how zoning, as it relates to housing affordability, I should say, because it really relates to all kinds of housing for all kinds of households, is really increasingly out of reach everywhere in the United States. We have two articles here that paint the national picture and draw on the fact that a national zoning atlas has been created Rhode Island was one of the earliest states, thanks to Bryce and another colleague who is no longer part of the team, with really getting the Rhode Island map up and running. We have been used numerous times now as an example of a state who has gotten this done. But also, we are now part of building out the region of New England. We have articles here on New Hampshire and Connecticut. Connecticut actually preceded Rhode Island. They really kicked it off because the Zoning Atlas director, Sarah Bronin, was originally out of Connecticut. And so we will actually be convening as a region in the end of April up in New Hampshire. It's very exciting with lots of opportunities coming out of this. And I do think if we advance the next slide, I'm going to be handing this off to Bryce. Oh, just one more. For those of you who work closely with your municipal planners, please ask them about the National American Planning Association's voice in this work. This is a clip from the APA, that is the American Planning Association's website. Again, this is a live link that shows that planning-led zoning reform is key to tackling many of the nation's greatest challenges. And because we do know that housing choice actually also supports our local economies, better education, connectivity to jobs, and better health outcomes, that there are many things at stake when we talk about being able to afford one's home, whether it is a rental home, whether it is a single family home or a condo, whatever you choose to live in, an ADU, they should all be options for all of us, especially in our two largest cities. And now I think I am handing it off to Bryce. No, I am not. I've got one more to go.
Annette, before you do that too, I just wanted to kind of put real life time around the importance of planners. As you know, as part of the speaker's package of bills yesterday, we'll be looking at trying to increase the capacity. We know where we do not have enough planners throughout the state to kind of plan and vision about what our communities should look like. And the legislature is going to be taking a look at that this session as well too. So onward to comprehensive plans.
Okay, sorry. And sorry for feeling like I'm not sure of how many slides I've got here, but I really do think this is the last one. So the link between a municipal planning and our state really lies in our comprehensive plans. The city of Warwick has an updated and adopted comprehensive plan that should now lead the vision for that city through 2033. Cranston is in the process of updating its comprehensive plan. So what you have here is a link to the existing comprehensive plan, which has expired, but also a link to the current plan for the work that is ongoing through this year and possibly into next, working with a number of our colleagues at Weston and Sampson, who is the consulting firm, but obviously with the city's planning staff as well. And here I am really handing it off to Bryce. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thanks, Annette. Just to reiterate, I'm Bryce Kelly, Senior Research Analyst at HousingWorks Rhode Island. And as Annette alluded to, myself and our former GIS consultant, Chris Schutz, really undertook the lift of creating the Rhode Island Zoning Atlas, but we didn't create it just out of thin air. Back in 2018, HousingWorks Rhode Island began collecting and analyzing residential zoning information and including it in the housing fact book. You may see it as the residential development ordinances, or whether or not a municipality allows for multifamily by right within their jurisdiction. But as we became engaged in the Rhode Island Zoning Atlas, we obviously started to really integrate a lot of the data that we were collecting into the fact book. In 2022, we really began collecting actual GIS related information around one family, two family, and three or more multifamily, as well as other important aspects to residential development. But in 2021, when Desegregate Connecticut published their first statewide zoning atlas, that's when we really became engaged in this project. The Desegregate Connecticut zoning atlas really grew into that National Zoning Atlas Collaborative, which we became the official Rhode Island partner in 2022. And really, as we began to ramp up our work and get closer to having that Rhode Island Zoning Atlas finished, we decided to have a soft launch of Kent County in 2023. And these images just show some of that work that we were producing prior to actually releasing the zoning atlas, utilizing a lot of the data and information we were collecting to simultaneously kind of release some snippets that were informing presentations or reports that we were doing at the time. And so I mentioned incorporating the zoning data into the fact book. We really did this primarily through the regional pages, most recently updating regional zoning and housing stock within our regions, really looking at, as a region, what areas are zoned for what with regards to single family, 2-family, and 3-family, taking into consideration protected land, undevelopable land, as it were. And here are two snippets of Southeast Providence County and Central RI, which are the two regions featured in the Housing Fact Book. But these charts do a really good job of showing what these regions are zoned for as compared to the actual existing housing stock that's actually on the ground, because there's often a disconnect between what zoning allows for and what is actually built. And so getting into actually creating a statewide zoning atlas, there was quite a bit of work, almost 2 years of work that went into collecting data, analyzing and cleaning data, and then configuring it in a way that we could actually have an interactive zoning atlas. We primarily followed the National Zoning Atlas methodology. They published a series of, I guess, iterations of this methodology. And because we engaged in it in the National Zoning Atlas Collaborative early on, we actually kind of had to evolve our work to meet that changing methodology. So you'll see we started in Google Sheets, collecting and analyzing zoning data, and we moved to a database. It's a zoning atlas editor database that lives on the National Zoning Atlas website that we then needed to import this data in. But this information is really rich with data. There's over 100 fields for each zoning district that we needed to fill out. We collected not only the shape files, the GIS files of zoning districts, but we had to compare what those GIS files look like to the most recent or most official zoning map, and make any edits necessary to make it match that official zoning map. In some cases, we actually needed to draw districts. Some municipalities didn't have those GIS shapefiles, so we had to draw them referencing official zoning maps. But basically, you can think of it as taking the GIS files for zoning districts and completing all of this data input, as you can see in the spreadsheet, and then merging it. And that is the information that is contained within the Rhode Island Zoning Atlas. So here are just some initial findings. At a general, very high level, we analyzed over 6,000 pages of zoning ordinance, zoning text. We logged just under 700 relevant zoning districts throughout Rhode Island's 39 cities and towns. The average number of districts per municipality came out to 18. Obviously, in Western Rhode Island, there are some municipalities that have maybe 5 or 6 zoning districts total. And then maybe in some more urban or cities and towns, maybe in the urban services boundary closer to the Bay, you're looking at over 30 zoning districts. So there is quite a bit of variation between Rhode Island cities and towns and how they zone their land. Looking at how, to that point, looking at how the land is zoned, 81% of Rhode Island is zoned as primary residential. And what that means is it allows for residential and customary accessory uses to residential. So we're looking at a lot of your R districts, or in some municipalities, A districts. Most often you'll see, if it's not strictly just residential, it would be an agricultural district that allows for housing, but has really large minimum lot sizes to really facilitate agricultural use. And then we have just under 10% of Rhode Island zoned for mixed with residential. Those are going to be your zoning districts that allow for residential and some other kind of maybe commercial or business use. They don't necessarily have to be combined within the same building, though they can. Really, it's just if residential is allowed within a district and some other kind of use that isn't strictly residential, that was coded as mixed with residential. And I should mention that the dark kind of greenish blue in this map represents that primary residential. The light blue represents mixed with residential. And finally, non-residential is represented by that orangish yellow. And non-residential is pretty self-explanatory, just no residential is allowed. That's going to be heavy industrial zoning districts, highway commercial zoning districts, those zoning districts that could not really facilitate residential uses from a health and safety standpoint. And now if we take a step deeper at that state level and look at how residential zoning districts are handled with regards to the types of housing that are allowed within them, unsurprisingly, 87% is zoned for single family by right, meaning that you can develop a single family home without needing to go through a public hearing or acquire a special use permit, as long as you follow the prescribed dimensional regulations. Two family, there's a significant drop off between single family and two family by right, with 20% of the state zoned for two family by right. And then when we get to what we would consider multifamily, which is 3 and 4, they hover about 9 and 8% respectively. The reason we broke out 3 and 4 family had to do with the National Zoning Atlas's methodology, because a lot of other states in the country may treat those housing types differently. It's not really the case. You can see there's very little difference. It's not really the case in Rhode Island, but there are some municipalities that do break that out. And then getting a little bit deeper, looking at minimum lot sizes, that is where, a lot of affordability really comes into play. Obviously, when you need a larger lot to develop a certain kind of structure, there are going to be higher costs associated with that. And so when we look at land zone for single family by right, 25% requires an acre or more. When we look at land zone for two family by right, almost 40% requires an acre or more. And then those multifamily categories by right require an acre or more. Those come out to just under half of that land zone that way. So you can see where minimum lot sizes really start to play a part in making some of these housing types less feasible to develop.
Bryce,
So,
can I add in before you move on? I mean, I think
sure.
that a lot of this data is really important, and I know we're going to look a little bit more closely at Warwick and Cranston in a little bit, but a lot of, particularly because of the age of our housing, a lot of the housing was built prior to some of these zoning requirements being put into place. And so a lot of what we like in our communities and what are currently in our communities, including in this region, Patuxent Village and other kind of more walkable neighborhoods and communities, are not replicable under existing zoning ordinances. So just wanted to kind of put that thought into folks' heads as we continue to dive in deeper.
Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, one of the maps that I showed earlier as an example of work that we've been doing shows the Main Street section of East Greenwich and how much of that could not be built today by current zoning standards. So that's a great point, and that's something to definitely keep in the back of your mind as we walk through the rest of this slide or the rest of this presentation. And so just want to go through quickly actually navigating the Rhode Island Zoning Atlas. It's highly interactive and it's very user friendly, but I think sometimes just to get the full picture and to really be able to use it to its highest extent. It's useful just to walk through. So when you get to the Rhode Island Zoning Atlas website, there's going to be a splash page where you need to just acknowledge that it may have errors. Things change very quickly, or sometimes things can change quickly, and it's not necessarily exact. This isn't an exact science. And then when you get to the map, it's broken out into primarily 5 sections. Of course, the main section being map itself. The top left is going to show you your different filtering options, where you can filter where you want to see where in the state you can build 1 family through 4 or more family housing. You can also select the minimum lot size that you're interested in. We've broken that out by categories. You can also select where you can build accessory dwelling units, though there's a lot of change there, obviously, with state legislation and municipalities amending their ordinances. So that's a snapshot in time, obviously. The next section of this map is going to show you the additional layers that you can add on top of the map to get some further context and really Rhode Island eyes. This zoning atlas that includes some conservation land layers, tribal lands, the urban services boundary, and then some infrastructure layers. The bottom right is going to show you your legend, so you can constantly kind of refer back to that to see what this color or that color means. When you do select additional layers in the bottom left pane, those will populate within the legend, so you know exactly what you're looking at. And then finally, there's a really useful search bar that you can actually input your address, where you work, an address you might be interested in, and learn about the zoning of that specific location, which I think is really powerful and can help really add that on the ground context of what can be kind of a overwhelming zoning map. And so I'm just going to walk through a couple different use cases, right, of this zoning map. So in this first example, we're going to be looking at single family, where we can build single family by right. In the case of the National Zoning Atlas methodology, they call that allowed/conditional. Again, it's just the term used in this case to make it standardized across the nation, but that is synonymous with by right for Rhode Island, which I think is what most of Rhode Island refers that to. And then we might be interested where you can build single family by right on less than a half an acre. And so you can really see how that changes between those 2 filtering options. And you can see where it's really congregated. Those smaller minimum lot sizes, quote unquote, smaller minimum lot sizes, are really congregated in those areas that have maybe infrastructure. They have more historic villages. They have denser development areas. You can see it really pops within Providence and the outlying suburbs, as well as in some areas within Aquidneck Island. And then we might move on to think or to look at where you could build 4 family housing, 4 or more multifamily housing by right again. And you can see that, again, a lot of it is in that more urban area throughout the state, except for Hopkinton and Richmond, which really pop. And you might want to, think through, okay, why is that? Why, do they truly allow multifamily housing? And then you apply the same lot size features in the filtering options and realize, oh, you're going to need quite large minimum lot sizes to develop multifamily housing within those 2 municipalities. And really it is exclusively in Providence and the outlying areas, and then some of the more denser areas throughout the state. Here is another example showing some of the layering options. And so here we're looking at 3 family housing by right. And again, we might be interested in, okay, how does that intersect with state conservation lands? Because in that last example, we saw, they might allow multifamily housing in Richmond and Hopkinton, but, I know that there's a lot of protected land there, and that's true, right? Zoning doesn't necessarily always take into account protected lands. There might be protected lands that are zoned for residential, right? But because it is protected, because it's state owned, it doesn't really need to be rezoned. And so this gives a little bit clearer of a picture of what is or a clearer picture of what is developable. There's obviously more factors involved than just state conservation land, but it's an important layer to add, we felt, as well as some of those other layers, to really Rhode Islandize and give that context to the true picture of zoning throughout the state. And I should mention, so again, you can look towards the legend on the bottom right and see that that green is populating, so you know what you're looking at. The same with the urban services boundary. So we added that layer in because the state really wants to see development directed towards their urban services boundary, where there's amenities and infrastructure, transit, all those kinds of things that make denser housing more viable for the state. You can also see that outside of those traditionally more urbanized areas, there are pockets of the urban services boundary that exist in Western Rhode Island. So it's important to consider all those places that have or that are within the urban services boundary. And then related to that, the urban services boundary obviously closely aligns with where we have infrastructure. So water districts and sewer areas are really important to consider when you're thinking about developing denser housing types. And so this is all just a very high level of using the map. But I think a very important and powerful feature of the zoning atlas is the ability to interact with it, right? And so when you click into the Rhode Island zoning atlas, and in this case, we clicked into Cranston, that first click is going to show you the municipality that you clicked on, and a pop-up will appear. This card will appear that you see in the center of the screen, and that's going to be some summary statistics, some broad level data about Cranston. You can see how it's zoned essentially as an entire municipality. And then if you click the arrow on the card to the right, you're going to be brought to the specific zoning district that you clicked on. And so in this case, we actually decided to filter on the top left for 2-family by right housing. So we're seeing where that is allowed. And we clicked on the residential B2 zoning district. And within the card that does pop up is the entire attribute table. All that data that I showed you that was going into those spreadsheets when we were initially creating the Rhode Island Zoning Atlas is present here. So you can learn about all the different dimensional regulations, special regulations associated with elderly or affordable housing, parking requirements, information about planned residential development opportunities. And so all of that information is contained within this card about that specific zoning district. So it's really powerful if you start from that very high level and start to really drill down into exactly what you're interested in. And so now that we've walked through how to navigate the Rhode Island Zoning Atlas, I'm going to pull out and talk a little bit more specifically about Cranston and Warwick.
Bryce, I'm sorry, can I interrupt again? Because I just want to give a little more context again as we dive in. I mean, this is a deep dive right into looking at zoning and land use issues in your community. And I know both state and local officials will be looking at some of this as well too. And so we know that the funding for building housing, particularly affordable housing, largely comes from the federal government in our state, some from the state government, but a big chunk of it from the federal government. But what you build and where you build, and even to a certain extent how you build, are all controlled at the local level. And so this stuff matters, right? And this matters very much at the local level as we think about growing and welcoming new families and new individuals into our community. How do we repurpose building? And so that's why we're trying to, dive into these details with you locally about where growth makes sense in your communities. And both Cranston and Warwick, as the second and third largest communities in our state, have more work to do in this space. So Bryce, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that context. So yeah, looking at a deeper dive, this really closely reflects what those summary statistics would have shown within the Rhode Island Zoning Atlas. I took it a little bit a step deeper here and really drilled down on what would be classified as undevelopable, meaning state, local, conservation lands, federal lands, water bodies, anything that really can't be developed. And so taking that into account, 76% of Cranston's developable land is zoned for primary residential development. Again, those are, it isn't R, like I mentioned, they're A in Cranston, but those residential only, essentially, zoning districts. 3% of Cranston's developable land is zoned for mixed with residential development, and then 21% is zoned for non-residential development. When you look at how that comes out to from a housing type perspective, 78% of unprotected lands allow for single family by right, 26% allow for two family by right, and then only 4% allow for multifamily by right. Again, why we talk about by right rather than what is allowed through a special use permit is that by right, when you're when you're building housing by right, you are you're more likely to be able to develop it how you envision it, right? When you have to go and go through a public hearing, you're granted a special use permit more often than not. It'll add costs, it'll add time. It will, sometimes it will reduce the scale of that project. So it's really important to consider first what is by right. And so looking at Warwick, slightly different, but it's somewhat similar. And you're going to notice, as you work through the Rhode Island Zoning Atlas, housing is treated and zoning is treated similarly in municipalities close to each other or that share a lot of characteristics. And so Warwick and Cranston are somewhat similar in how they zone their land. In this case, Warwick's zoned 70% for primary residential, 11% for mixed with residential, and 19% for non-residential. And then again, going a bit deeper, it's a little bit more stark here. 80% of unprotected land is zoned for single family by right, and then only 2% for two family by right and multifamily by right. And it's important to consider those denser housing types, of course, because that is more of what the housing that we need in the state, right? We need, especially within the urban services boundary, these denser housing types, especially along transit corridors near amenities, to really make use of the location of those homes. It's really, really important to consider that. And so, as I just kind of alluded to, here we just undertook an analysis of a RIPTA proposed bus rapid transit route that extends through Warwick and into Cranston. And we just decided to look at the zoning there, because obviously to make transit work and work effectively, and to have enough stops, to have enough frequency to make those stops make sense, you need housing, right? You need housing near those routes. And so what we did here is we took RIPTA's proposed bus rapid transit route from TF Green up through Cranston, and we applied a 1/4 mile buffer radius around the route. And that is a generally accepted distance that is walkable among transit-oriented development planning, among those that look at transit in relation to housing. It's almost always going to include that 1/4 mile buffer. So it's really important to consider the zoning not just along a transit route, but outside the transit route slightly. And so here we see that 56% of this transit route is zoned for primary residential, 24% is zoned for mixed with residential, and then is zoned for non-residential. And it's important also to note that undevelopable land is removed from these calculations, again, just to get a much more clearer picture. And so when we take it again a step deeper, as we did with just general zoning, you can see that one family zoning really does dominate that route, does dominate that buffered area around the bus rapid transit. It's quite substantial as compared to the zoning for two-family by right and multifamily by right. And again, the overarching theme here is to make a lot of these transit routes work and make them sustainable. You need to have higher density housing around them within walkable distance to these bus stops. So it's really important to consider how municipalities are zoning around transit to make transit work and to facilitate transit, helping the residents of those municipalities, and to reduce car dependency, right? And at the request of Annette, we're including some redevelopment potential opportunities in Cranston and Warwick as it relates to schools, right? And Annette, feel free to jump in here wherever necessary. But here we took a lot of schools that were either closed or expected to close, and applied a half-mile buffer around those schools to look at the zoning, and also included current RIPTA bus routes to understand how transit intersects with zoning and how that intersects with these schools. And again, the same themes persist, right, through Cranston and Warwick, in that there is residential zoning around these schools, but more often than not, that residential zoning favors one family by right, rather than those higher density housing types. And that's important because, you need to consider how many families can live close to those schools, the busing implications, and transit implications of getting students to those schools, and generally having residential around your schools is favorable to make those schools viable, right? If you have no residential development around a school and enrollment drops, then what happens is those schools may need to close. And of course, it's added implications of where these schools are located with redevelopment potential into housing, right? The speaker's package last year included a bill around redevelopment of schools. And so it's really important to consider where these schools are, and if they are being considered for closure, how the areas around them are zoned and how transit intersects with those school locations. And then finally,
Bryce, I'm
yeah.
sorry. I do want to just take a second because I want to thank you, first of all, for adding these. I want to point out that Warwick does have plans for a number of these schools, if not all of them. Cranston schools, for the moment, some of these schools are being used while the school Gladstone is being rebuilt. But I wanted to share this particularly because this kind of planning needs to take place ahead of time. And those conversations between the city and the school district need to be taking place now. And because Warwick has House of Hope, which is a wonderful CDC, but with a mission mostly serving those who have been unhoused, whereas Cranston does not really have a dedicated CDC, although we certainly are neighboring Providence, and we could be engaging in those discussions now. I also just want to point out, because Bryce has helpfully included the RIPTA bus routes, how nearly all of these schools are really quite close to bus routes. So the idea that these could be utilized to revitalize the building and the existing area would be a real bonus, especially in Cranston, where we do not have plans yet for using these schools for housing. Thank you, Bryce.
Okay. And then lastly, obviously, there's a lot of climate implications with housing right now. This winter has been particularly wet, with lots of flooding along the Patuxent River and other rivers throughout Rhode Island. And so I think it's important to include how we're zoning for areas, what zones, what areas are especially at risk of flooding. Here we included on the left the zoning district types again, with those added overlays of high risk and high risk coastal flood zones, as well as where in Cranston and Warwick they're zoned for single family, two family, and multifamily by right, and those flood zones as well, to really understand how we're zoning these areas in relation to these impacts that are more and more becoming top of mind and really important to consider. We're going to be doing more work around sea level rise and different climate change scenarios and their intersections with zoning. But I think it's increasingly becoming imperative to consider things like flood zones, things like sea level rise, and how we're zoning effectively to protect ourselves from these factors. And so this slide really just dives a bit deeper into that topic, right? And so we've done a lot of work, obviously releasing the Rhode Island Zoning Atlas and doing some of these deeper dives in some subjects. But what is next? We're really doing a lot of presentations, doing a lot of walkthroughs with the Rhode Island Zoning Atlas, different stakeholders in different areas throughout the state, to get people familiarized with the tool and how it can be used, and also to get feedback, right? To understand on the ground where there are opportunities, where we should take deeper dives, and on what topics. We're going to be hosting a series of lunch and learns that will do just that, take deeper dives into specific topics that we feel are really imperative to this zoning conversation. And of course, we're going to be spreading awareness of the Zoning Atlas and trying to get more stakeholders involved. What those deeper dives will consist of will be initially an analysis of zoning within delineated growth centers. The state has identified proposed growth centers that should have a higher level of density, that does have infrastructure, that does have amenities. And so are those areas being considered? Are they being zoned appropriately to absorb that density? And then we're also looking, again, like I just mentioned, areas projected to be impacted by sea level rise scenarios and climate change. What I'm working on right now, much deeper, is zoning around transit, and then zoning in agriculture. So, really, how are we zoning our areas that are prime farmlands, to preserve those farmlands, and then to also consider where it is most appropriate to have housing, and not have those two, areas kind of butting heads, which they really shouldn't, if you consider growth centers and the urban services boundary. And with that, I'll just leave everybody with this QR code and the link to the Rhode Island Zoning Atlas. I should also mention that the National Zoning Atlas has now launched their combined, zoning atlas. Beforehand, all of the states individually stood up a zoning atlas, but now the National Zoning Atlas has stood up a integrated zoning atlas on their website, where all of the features, the colors, the symbols are all the same, so you can compare state to state really easily. So definitely check that out. And then with that, I'll stop sharing, but definitely appreciate.
Why don't you leave that screen up, Bryce? But thank you so much for all of the great material and information. We know there's a lot of detail here and a lot of information that we're providing. I did want to just add a comment about the transit line through Cranston and Warwick. A lot of that, obviously, within the boundary is single family homes, but we also know that a lot of those homeowners are older homeowners based on demographics in each of those cities or towns. And so aging in place and aging in community and the climate, and how do we get to our carbon emission goals. Both transportation and housing are their top two contributors. And so unless we kind of work together with transportation alternatives in our state, we're never going to get to those emission goals as well too. And so, you know, all of this matters, right? And is currently impacting all of our communities right now. And certainly climate change and flooding, urban flooding issues and other things that we're seeing are things that we know we're going to continue to struggle with as a community. So we're hopeful that this tool is a tool that is useful and helpful at the local level to be making decisions about where growth and planning for growth and planning for development, planning for reuse in your community makes sense. We're going to stick with it and continue to dive in deeper, as Bryce has mentioned, into certain areas that we know are a particular issue and concern to Rhode Island cities and towns. And with our colleagues at HousingWorks and all of us at HousingWorks and with our colleagues at Housing Network and Homes RI campaign, we're eager to continue to work with you to figure out where we can allow growth and development in our state, and working towards what I think is a common goal, that we have a safe and affordable home for every Rhode Islander. All of us, I'm not sure if we have a slide with our emails, but there's some contact information here, obviously some general contact information. We'll follow up with some materials after this presentation. I know our colleagues at Housing Network will be posting this to their YouTube channel, but please feel free to reach out, and we're always happy to come and talk with you or your colleagues in your community about how to address some of these issues. So with that, I'll open it up to my other colleagues to see if anybody has any other final comments or thoughts.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Katie West, the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Housing Network of Rhode Island, and just want to say thank you to our colleagues at HousingWorks for this presentation and for the work that they've done on the zoning atlas. Homes RI, which is coordinated by the Housing Network, is our effort to advocate for increasing the supply of safe, healthy, and affordable homes. And I think we all know and are increasingly understanding the role that zoning has played in our the state of housing that we see today. And so as a resident of Warwick, this was informative for myself, but we will be continuing to share this information and connect folks to HousingWorks to learn more about this tool. It's especially important for policymakers as you're making to inform these decisions, both the state and the local level. So thank you very much, everybody, for your time today. And we will follow up via email to everybody who was invited to this, and sharing this on our YouTube, as Brenda mentioned. So want to get it out there to folks.
Thanks everyone for your time. And again, please feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions. Thanks again.